Warframe is a game with a very wide selection of weapons. We have weapons like the Amprex, which is great versus groups of enemies due to its area of effect, but suffers versus the tougher units due to its relatively low damage. We have bows, sniper rifles, and to some extent burst rifles as well, which are the exact opposite of weapons like the Amprex. They are great versus the tougher enemies because they have very high damage, but they suffer versus groups of enemies due to their low fire rate. Automatic rifles are somewhere in between. They have the fire rate to deal with groups of enemies, and they also do enough damage combined with the fire rate to take care of the tougher units, though they will never be as good at dealing with groups of enemies as something like the Amprex, and they will never take down the tougher units as fast as something like the Dread or Vectis Prime. We also have a wide variety of shotguns, which are kind of like sniper rifles for short range. They deal very high damage, so they're great at dealing with the tougher units, but they also have pellet spread and damage fall-off, which means that the majority of the damage will be lost if you're firing at enemies that are far away. They're also explosive weapons, which can deal very high damage in an area of effect, but usually come with a pretty severe drawback. In the case of Tonkor, it's not too bad. You have to get used to the projectile travel time and also the projectile fall-off, but in the case of Tsar and many other explosive weapons, you have to deal with self-damage, and it can sometimes feel like it's much easier to kill yourself than the enemies. And then there are weapons that you use when you really want to kill something. Weapons that can one-shot the enemy 20 times over with a single shot. Weapons that deserve proper introduction. The Opticor, the hardest hitting rifle in the entire game. A fully charged shot will hit the enemy for 1000 damage before any mods are added to the weapon. The majority of this damage comes in the form of puncture, so every shot will do 850 puncture damage, 100 impact damage, and 50 slash damage. But there is a catch. It takes 2.5 seconds to fully charge a shot. You can fire partially charged shot if you charge it at least 1/3 of the way, but that will cut the damage by half, which is still 500 damage. The supportive stats are also nothing to write home about. The reload speed is quite lengthy for a weapon with just 5 shots in the magazine, and a 15% status and critical chance on a single shot weapon is nowhere near the amount you would need to reliably proc status or crit. But then again, this is the Opticor. You don't need to crit. Getting the Opticor is nothing difficult as long as you have a clan. Simply head over to the Corpus Lab in your dojo and pick up the blueprint for 15,000 credits. The resources to build the Opticor aren't too difficult to get either. You will need 30,000 credits, 5 field drone, 20 gallium, 600 cryotic, and 1 Forma. The Opticor is the BFG of Warframe, the big f***ing gun. And with a proper build, this weapon can one-shot the majority of the enemies the game can throw at you, even with the partially charged shot, which only deals 50% of the weapon's damage. And as if all of that was not enough, the weapon also does a decent amount of splash damage, so it's great at dealing with tightly grouped enemies. So you may be somewhat surprised to hear that the Opticor has strong Riven disposition, allowing it to get some of the most powerful Rivens in the game. And that's because Riven disposition isn't dictated by the power of the weapon, but how much it's being used by the general player base. So, as you've probably figured out, not a lot of people use the Opticor. I've personally invested 7 Forma into my Opticor, adding 2 Vs, 3 dashes, and 2 Ds. Now the mods I'm using are Serration for more damage, Split Chamber for multi-shot, then I'm using Heavy Caliber for even more damage, and the negative accuracy doesn't affect the Opticor too much. Sometimes the beams will split, but most of the time they will hit the same spot. Then I've added Vial Acceleration, which cuts down on the charge time quite significantly, and this is very important because without it the weapon feels, well, simply slow. Without any fire rate, even the uncharged shots feel very clunky, since you can't fire the weapon unless you've charged it at least 1/3 of the way, so that's why I've added Vial Acceleration there. Next up, I'm using Stormbringer and Infected Clip, which gives me 20,000 corrosive damage, and I'm combining that with cold damage from primed cryo rounds, which adds a lot, but I also have a Riven, Opticor Hera Gellican. This is a very mediocre Riven when it comes to the Opticor. It's essentially cryo rounds combined with Split Chamber. I thought about cycling the Riven a couple more times to hopefully get one of the amazing Rivens that I've seen on the internet, but then I thought it would probably be better to showcase the power of the weapon with a mediocre Riven that's much easier to get. If you don't have a Riven though, you can easily use something like Point Strike for more critical chance, another Elemental mod for more elemental damage, or even something like Firestorm, which will increase the area of effect of the splash damage. The amount of damage this setup can do is pretty ridiculous, and it quite literally one-shots 95% of the enemies the game can throw at you even at level 100. The remaining 5% of the enemies do take quite a few more shots like this corrupted bombard, and that's because they simply have way too much armor at level 100. But that's the case with every weapon in the game if you don't strip the enemy of their armor or you're not cheesing them. Though it doesn't take anywhere near as many shots if we bump the enemy level down to 80, which is the level of enemies you will find in a Kuva Flood mission. Now there is one more downside to the Opticor that I've yet to mention, and that's the fact that it will fire as soon as it's fully charged, so you better have it aimed at something when you start charging it, because every missed shot is a lot of missed damage thanks to the charge time. It's also not ideal versus the infested because they have a lot of smaller units rather than few big ones, but it's not a big deal. I was able to do all 3 infested sorties on my own. I like to use the Opticor with a Warframe that complements it, something like Frost, where I can use Bubble to slow the enemies down, making them easier to hit, and even use Avalanche to clear out the smaller units and then take care of the bigger units with the Opticor. This is a weapon that you have to try on your own to see if you like it or not, because it's very niche. Some people love it and some not so much. I personally really like the Opticor, but I'm also a fan of bows and sniper rifles, so maybe if you're not a fan of bows and sniper rifles, this may not be a weapon for you. But as I've said already, you should definitely try it out for yourself, because it's, at least in my opinion, a lot of fun. And that's pretty much it for the video, so I thank you very much for watching as always, and I will see you next time. Bye bye!